Welcome back to our introduction to the Yang 88 Simplified Long Form. This is going on part 12, if my counting is correct, which is pretty cool. And I hope that we continue on through the end of the form. Last week, we looked at repulse monkey. Repulse monkey ends with us holding a ball before going into slant flying. Slant flying's movement is effectively identical to part horse's mane. The only difference is the stepping and a larger turn, but other than that, it's pretty much the same thing. So I'm going to put that on hold, put a little pin in that one, as they say, and we'll be discussing that when we get to part horse's mane several pieces from now. So the next unique move that we'll encounter is going to be needle to sea bottom and followed by fan through back. So to begin with, we start this move coming out of a brush knee. Now there is some variation. You may find people will add a play peepaw here before going into needle to sea bottom. That wasn't how I originally learned the form, so I'm not going to do it that way. But most of the mechanics are pretty much identical if you do it that way or if you do it this way. So we're going to do it this way. So we've just finished our brush knee, and now we're going to be doing a half step up into an empty stance, just like usual. Hands come down together, shift into the heel of the foot. We've got a ball like here. I'm going to rotate the ball around, more on that later, and then drop, sink, pull up, step forward, and then shift. As you shift forward, the hands move apart from each other. So this posture here is the needle to sea bottom. Needle, sea bottom. You don't have to go all the way down as far as the leg technique works. It's good to do if you're able to do something like a piston squat, and it helps strengthen your legs, but it's not, I would say, integral to the movement of the form. Rather, the internal dropping sensation is what we should be focusing on. We looked at that when we did the gather and then carry tiger to mountain videos. That's sort of dropping internally. You're relaxing downward into your root, into your core more specifically. So you got some whole body and leg breakdown out on the floor. As you can see, the stepping is nothing you haven't done before. The only difference is how much you choose to emphasize the squat in the movement. Now, I place special emphasis on training Taiji the proper way, which is training it specifically for the development of internal power. However, there is some value to be had in focusing on its more exterior motions. And in this case, the squat is much more of an external training method than it would be an internal one. However, if you've got the legs for it and you want to train the legs for it and to get better at it, it is very valuable to consider that strength training to develop that squat. But it is, again, not, I would say, integral to the move. The integral part of the move is the internal dropping that we focused on with things like the gather that finishes off section 1 of the move, of the form. And really that dropping should be in pretty much every move, but in needle to sea bottom, the whole motion of the move, at least at first glance, is mostly sort of settling downwards. So we want to focus on that inside. Part of this settling downwards is also going to entail an implied circular motion. It's going to be this sort of circle in front of us. So when we're doing the move, you can kind of see as I'm here, the hands come together, but then they rotate this way. They sort of do this rotational this way, right? Focusing on this motion, one, basically this motion, but it's on both sides and you have two hands, so you're sort of thinking of both sides of that circle rotating forward. So it's going to be a rotation in, and then you want to start the drop internally to pull it up, just as this is dropping down, and now rotate and continue the drop as we sink our hand down toward the floor. As we're doing this internal drop, we want to think not just with our hand dropping toward the floor, because that is sort of the baseline part of this, that's the most external idea. We want to think of that internal dropping sensation coming like starting in our core and that core rotating with that rotation here. But then we want to think of coming up the spine, our attention coming up the spine and relaxing all the way up, relaxing the shoulders, relaxing the arms. And that relaxation, I think I mentioned before, kind of like water coming through a rock. You want that tension to be pulling down to the feet, just the tension like melting off and coming down into the feet. We say we should practice Taiji in as relaxed a state as we can. And the last video we went over a little bit about how relaxation, as far as Taiji is concerned, is not really a state you achieve so much as something that you are constantly doing, because we're constantly moving. And when we position our bodies in different postures, naturally the tension will be carried differently. So we want to keep focusing on relaxing as we do that. This is another example of doing that where the form is specifically drawing your attention to that sensation. Now you probably noticed out on the floor, or if you already know the form, that our hands are beginning this motion by coming towards each other and then rotating around before parting. That should prompt you to think there's a press here, because there is. So as we're pulling the hands together, we want to think of compression, contraction through the core, kind of like expanding towards ourselves, right? But this compression is not, like in other moves, it's not overly stated. So we don't want to think with that compression out here in our hands. Remember, what the hands are doing should be considered largely incidental to what the internal mechanics are telling you to do. And they're along for the ride, in other words. So in this case, this compression, we want to think of starting either in the shoulders, or if you're even more really kind of in the hips, because we're contracting, we're pulling the hips closer together as we do our step up. That step up is prompted by the hips undergoing this compression and we judging to move forward. And then also as the hips are undergoing that mild compression, so are the shoulders pulling together. That pull together down into the core is what is prompting this motion here, and then we roll it around, and then we roll it around as we start our drop. All of this is in here, right? If you're a beginner and you've only just learned this move, then you want to start with the external characteristics first, like make sure the hand's in the right position, the other hand's going in the right position, you have that step up all set. But if you've already got that and you're looking for more to do with the move, this is where you should be focusing your attention. How do I get my arms into these positions without necessarily like trying to put them there, if that makes any sense? This common theme of internal mechanics generating the motion out here, that's Tai Chi. As I mentioned, your squat here is not integral to the move as far as going all the way down. You can do it just to get the extra training, that's fine. If you're going to do it, make sure you're doing it with all the proper fundamentals in mind, which means you should still be undergoing that internal drop, and you should also have your weight mostly all the way through the heels. In Taiji practice, we always say, you've probably heard it from your instructor before, keep your weight in your heels as you do the moves, which is mostly true. You do want to keep your weight through your heels. However, you don't want to get in the habit of having your weight all the way in the back of your heels, because now you're going to be undergoing, your system will have to undergo a certain amount of tension through its front just to keep you standing. You want your tension equalized, for the most part, as much as it can be anyway, between front and back, between left and right, not between top and bottom. This equalization is only possible if you have the weight in the right part of the foot. So if your weight's 110% back through your heels, then you're not going to be doing that right. You're going to be sort of back here, and all this is going to be tensing up. So to get it right, you kind of want to make sure that your weight is kind of just in front of the heel, which is hard to pinpoint. The reason we tell everybody, put your weight through your heels on day one, is because naturally occurring tension in the body kind of wants our weight to be forward on the balls of our feet. And when we learn to stand and when we learn to walk, we learn to walk basically by preventing ourselves from hitting the ground by putting our foot in front of us. So we have a rolling sensation across the foot to continually push our weight toward the ball of the foot, ball of our feet. Taiji doesn't want us to do that. And actually, when you look at pretty much any martial system, they will have an emphasis on keeping your weight on the balls of your feet for quick, rapid movement. But whenever they're generating power, like a strong blow or a strong punch or something like that, or a strong kick, usually they'll say drop your weight into your heels so that you can make true, proper contact, full contact with the ground. Taiji builds on that to an even greater extent. You will still be able to do rapid movement in this position, but that's a topic for a completely different lesson, video, whatever. The point is here that weight distribution across the foot is going to, at first, if you're unfamiliar with this type of standing, it's going to feel like you're mostly through your heel. Once that becomes more second nature and you're much more relaxed in just pulling your weight through your foot, then you should start paying attention to, all right, now it's through my heel, approximately how much is distributed across the balls of the feet and then across the outside ridge, the outside knife edge of the foot. Because there should be a little bit in those places too. It's just you want to make sure that your weight is basically through the foot the right way. That's all it is. You'll want to keep this in mind as you pull yourself out of the squat as well and then continue on forward, making sure that because you're doing the squat all the way down, your weight isn't drifting forward once you're down there, and now you're sort of pushing through the toes or pushing through the balls of the feet of the foot, the only foot, to pull yourself back up. This should be, if you're doing this very externally, this should be very easy to feel and identify because it's going to strain the muscles in a way that they don't really like. If you're doing squats, you should be down through your heels. You probably already know that. So we come out of needle to sea bottom and we are coming up and in. First we've come up and then we're sort of mostly all in, sort of coming in towards ourselves, contracting before we take a step forward and have this big, nice, expansive movement known as fan through back. Fan through back, relatively simple. You are pushing your foot, front foot out forward and then shifting your weight forward as you expand in, again, both directions. We haven't covered this move before, but all of the basic moving parts in this move should be pretty familiar to you by now if you've been watching this series in sequence. So you have that expansion, you have that movement of core to, from one foot into the next foot, that sort of assertion of space and gaining space. There are different applications for this move that require a little bit of tinkering with, but the important part here is that you are expanding, again, through the core all the way out to the palms of the hands as you shift your weight simultaneously. Which means that if we're expanding in the core and our core is moving from one foot to the other foot, that means that our hips are involved. And we don't want to just think of pulling, we want to think of opening the hips as you do that expansion. Remember, whatever the shoulders are doing, the hips are kind of telling them to do it by doing smaller versions of the same thing. It's kind of like that anyway. It's not quite that one-to-one, but if the shoulders are doing something, you can bet the hips are doing something else or the same thing. They're doing something. They're not inert. And you want to be consciously aware of the hips in all of your moves. This is a good example because it's one where if you're just thinking of shifting your weight from one foot to the other, you don't have to think with your hips in order to do that, but you should, because that will give you better understanding of how to open the core, right? Or open the core. The core is not really opening, but that's how to open the hips and get that space and to sort of rotate in the right way. Very subtle rotation, by the way. Yang doesn't emphasize rotation in the hips like you would see in, say, Xingyi or in Chen style Taiji. That's all we got. that brings us to the end of today's piece. We looked at needle to C-bottom, Fanter back, and focused on where your weight should be on your feet, which seems like an elementary question, but it deserves some attention. One last point on that is when we are thinking of our feet and thinking of compression or contracting, when we're pulling towards the core, we still want to be relaxing and dropping our attention down, through our feet, because that's what's connected to the ground. But we also want to think of, just as we're thinking of pulling our arm inward all the way to the core, we also want to think of pulling our feet inward toward the core as well. It's just sometimes we're doing that and we're actually lifting it off the ground. Sometimes we're doing that and we're dropping into a stance a little bit more securely. Likewise, when we expand and push away from our core with our hands, we're also pushing away from our core with our feet. I guess I'm sort of phrasing this a little bit backwards, because the core is where our control center is, our main point of reference. So it should feel like the core is pushing the feet away. The core is pushing the hands away. Likewise, the core is inviting the hands back, inviting the feet to be closer for contracting or compression as well. So think of these things as you do it, and in the case of the feet, where the weight is going, think of those points on the feet as what's being pushed away or what's being pulled inward. At some point, I'd like to discuss how these should also be coiling motions as well, but Yang style doesn't emphasize the coil as much as Chen does, and it might be more appropriate to do that in a Chen style setting, but I don't know. The coiling should be there. The Yang is more complete with some of the coiling, but that's a story for another time. But in any case, we've reached the terminus, we've reached the end of this part. We will be back, hopefully, for part 13 next time. And we will be looking at the turnaround that follows this move and then half of a repeat before moving on. Now we're getting into the point of the form where you're going to see more repetition taking place, and so we'll be skipping further and further ahead as we do the unique parts of the moves. As always, this is not intended to be any sort of substitute for in-person, real instruction. These are more just to help give you a bit more food for thought if you're already a practitioner, or to attract your interest if you're not. So I want to thank you again for watching, thank you again for listening, and I will see you in the next one.